Summary of How to Read Literature Like a Professor by Thomas C. Foster. Foster starts the book by saying that it was written for non-traditional college students and adults who are new to literary analysis. So, it was a big surprise that the book became so famous in high schools and was even put on the AP Literature course list. Foster starts his description of how teachers read by talking about how most students don't want to read in a professional way. It might seem like the professor is just pulling analysis out of thin air, but in reality, he or she has just learned the language of reading, a set of tools and conventions that allow scholars to connect with literature on a deeper and more complex level. Memory, symbols, and patterns are the three most important parts of the language of reading. Foster says that every journey in a piece of writing, even a simple trip to the food store, can be seen as a quest. The most important part of a quest is not the swords and dragons, but how the character learns about himself or herself. In the same way, every time people eat together, it's a form of communion, not necessarily in the way Christians think of it, but in the way that it's a practice of sharing that brings them together for a short time. Vampires are a big deal in writing, but it's not just to scare people. Vampire stories are generally about sexuality, with the vampire being a symbol of a sexual predator who wants to take advantage of a young, innocent target. Different works of literature have the same characters, symbols, stories, and themes because no work of literature is ever totally unique. In fact, it is possible to think of all writing as part of one story that has been going on for a long time and in many different places. William Shakespeare is one of the most important people in the history of English writing. The Elizabethan writer had a unique effect on authors who came after him and on the evolution of the English language, and his work is often mentioned in other works of writing. The Bible is another big source of inspiration for writers. A book doesn't have to be religious to be full of symbols and images from the Bible. Greek myth and fairy tales are two other important sources of inspiration. These kinds of stories are deeply ingrained in our shared cultural mind, and they show up in writing in both direct and indirect ways. Foster says in the first aside that it may be hard to believe that authors put so many layers of meaning into their work on purpose. But the fact that we can never know for sure what an author meant doesn't make it wrong to try to figure out complex symbolic and intertextual meanings. In writing, for example, descriptions of the weather are never just for fun, they always mean something. Violence in writing always stands for something, just like how the weather does. This includes violence that characters do to each other and violence that the author or storyteller does to kill or hurt characters to move the story along. Foster leaves the part on violence to talk about symbols in a more general way. Almost everything in a piece of writing can be read as a symbol, but things rarely have only one symbolic meaning. If they did, they wouldn't be symbols, but metaphor. Foster says that there are two types of political literature: works whose main goal is to promote a direct, historically specific political agenda, and literature that is political in a more general sense because it was written in a certain political climate by an author with a certain relationship to the world around them. Using this second meaning, almost all writing is at least a little bit political. Foster says that the Christ figure is very important in literature and that Christ figures often take unusual shapes. He also says that literature is full of biblical symbols. The ability to fly is also a very important literary device, and it is almost always linked to the idea of freedom. Even though it might seem like English teachers are too focused on finding sexual meaning in the strangest places, they do this for a good reason. Most of the time in history, writers couldn't write about sexuality in a clear way without being accused of being filth. Because of this, writers often show sexuality in a roundabout way. Sigmund Freud's impact on the study of literature is another important reason why sexual subtext is important. Foster, on the other hand, warns the reader that when sex is shown in writing, it almost always has a deeper meaning than the act itself, just like the weather and violence. Foster brings up the trope of people coming out of the water, which is a sign of baptism and goes back to the theme of Christian symbols. Foster then talks about how geography, or the physical traits of the place where a literary work takes place, tends to be linked to certain meaning norms. The same is true for the seasons. authors often play with the meaning of seasons in a humorous way, which is made easier by the traditional meanings of seasons, like how spring is associated with new life. The second break goes back to the idea of one story. Foster says that our society is full of stories that are connected to each other and that authors add depth to their work by making connections to these stories. After this break, Foster talks about how physical abnormalities tell us something about the characters who have them, especially in works written during a time when these physical marks were seen as signs of moral weakness. Literature has a long history of writing about blindness. Physical blindness is often used as a metaphor for not having self-awareness or planning. In the same way, illness is generally a sign that something is wrong with a character's body and soul. Heart disease is a very common theme in writing because the heart has long been seen as the center of human emotion. In the next chapter, Foster talks about how important it is to put aside one's own personal history in order to understand a piece of writing in its own time and place. To fully understand works of writing that were written in a different time, place, or society than our own, we have to let go of some of our own opinions. Foster then talks about how hard it is to understand private symbols, which are symbols that mean something special to the author but not to anyone else. Even though it can be hard to figure out what these marks mean, the reader will eventually be able to do so with practice and trust. Foster says in the beginning of the last chapter on irony that irony trumps everything. All of the literary techniques that have been talked about so far in the book can be used in an ironic way, which leads to completely different and more complicated effects. Foster puts a short story by Catherine Mansfield called The Garden Party, 1922, at the end of the book so that the reader can try out the reading methods he has talked about. In The Garden Party, a rich English family throws a party in their mansion's yard. A young woman called Laura, who is one of the family's daughters, is looking forward to the party until she hears that a man from a poor village near her family's land was thrown from a horse and cart and killed. Laura tries to get her family to cancel the party out of respect for the man's family, but they laugh at her and say it's a crazy plan. The party goes on, and Laura is able to have fun. After the party is over, she takes the extra food to the man's house and is forced to look at his dead body. When she sees his calm face, Laura feels better about everything that has happened, but she is still confused by how strange life is. Foster gives examples of how some of his students interpreted the story. These students point out the differences between classes in the story and explain what certain symbols, like birds, mean. Foster hopes that How to Read Literature Like a Professor will get people to do more research like this. Foster's own version of The Garden Party is based on how it relates to the Greek myth of Persephone, whose journey to the underworld symbolizes the change from childhood to adults and, in particular, the beginning of sexuality. Foster says at the end of the book that it can be hard to trust your own reading of a text, but that readers should trust their instincts and believe that their own interpretation is important because it is different. Even though the book doesn't cover all literary methods and reading techniques, the ones it does cover should point readers in the right direction and give them a chance to improve their skills through practice.
About the author. Thomas C. Foster is a former English professor from the University of Michigan Flint. He grew up in a small town in Ohio. He says he kept from being lonely as a child by reading all the time. He then went to Dartmouth College and Michigan State University to study. In 1987, he joined the staff at Michigan Flint. He knows a lot about British, Irish, and American writers from the beginning of the 20th century. He has written a number of popular books that try to make writing and literary analysis easier to understand.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.